afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Like many of you, I've often heard that Livorno was a center of Jewish learning and commerce. But it was only in the course of doing my Romance Language Jewish Journey monthly newsletter about Livorno, because I had had so many requests from the Italian community to delve into what was the history of Livorno, the Jewish history of Livorno, that I discovered just how unique Livorno was. I became intrigued, and I think you will as well, by the fascinating history of this today really very scarcely and sparsely visited city. Many people tell you they go to Florence on their tour, they'll go to Pisa. Livorno is often skipped. It's become a cruise ship destination often, unfortunately. The history there is absolutely fascinating, and I think you will agree. I discovered that Livorno in the early modern period, from the late 15th century through the late 18th century, roughly, became a commercial powerhouse and a center for Jewish publishing, Hebrew publishing, thanks to at a time when Jews were living behind ghetto walls, when they were confined to the second-hand rag trade, when they endured expulsions from the Inquisition from Spain and Portugal, forced conversions, and were fleeing the Inquisition. However, the conversos who arrived in Livorno were able to prosper and thrive thanks to the vision of the powerful Medici Grand Dukes, specifically Cosimo, who we're going to see in a moment, and Ferdinand I, his successor, who extended unheard of privileges to the Jews who were fleeing the Inquisition and to their descendants. The Jewish nation, Nassau in Portuguese, Nazione in Italian, became a financial powerhouse that greatly benefited the Medicis financially. Let's take a closer look at how all this happened and why. It was challenging for me to stick to the time constraints given the incredible scope of this topic. We can go into all the contributions the Jews made, including the culinary contributions, and the idea that tomatoes were brought in by the Sephardic Jews, etc. And we're going to go into it a little bit, but I'd be happy to answer any questions during the course of the conference. So now we're going to talk about Livorno, the city without a ghetto. So for 300 years, Livorno was a point of reference for diaspora Jews. A vibrant Jewish community existed here for centuries due to the vision of the Medicis, and specifically to a document that we're going to look at in a minute called the Livornina of 1591 and 1593, which extended these rights to Jews that attracted Jews from all over the converso world. While most of Europe was struggling with financial crises, Livorno became a shining example of success and prosperity. So where is Livorno? As you see, Livorno, also known in English as Leghorn, there are several names for it, is a port city on the west coast of Tuscany, just south of Pisa. Now, what makes the Jewish journey in Livorno so unique? Well, first of all, it's the least ancient among the Jewish population, Jewish communities. We hear about Rome going back over 2,000 years, Venice, Bologna, those great cities. Obviously, Livorno was much more recent in terms of having a major Jewish population. However, what makes Livorno so distinct is that Jews were never forced to live in a ghetto. That's why it's known also as the city without a ghetto. Livorno became the second largest Sephardic Jewish settlement after Amsterdam. Converso Jews who came to Livorno, who were brought to Livorno because of the privileges that the Medicis extended to them, continued with their strong trading ties to North Africa, India, and beyond. The port of Livorno was also interesting because it had originally been a backwater town. No one wanted to live there. The major port had been in Pisa, and then what happened is Pisa's port started filling with sand, and Pisa could no longer accommodate the large mercantile ships. So it was with great foresight that the Medicis, starting with Cosimo, thought, okay, well, let's build up Livorno and make Livorno a powerhouse. And that's exactly what he planned, and that's exactly what happened. So why did Spanish and Portuguese Jews come to Livorno? Those of us who were fortunate enough to see the movie, The Children of the Inquisition, last night, really got a great background into the expulsions and the Inquisition and the horrors and how the Jews dispersed. So we know that without going into it too much, we know that in 1492 the Jews were expelled from Spain, and then in 1497, well, there were 100,000 Jews who went from Spain to Portugal, and then tragically 5 years later in 1497, the Jews were expelled once again from Portugal. And where did they go? Many fled to the Ottoman Empire, where they lived as second-class citizens, but were not forcibly converted, and they were not tortured. Others, and they were not forced to convert as well. Others fled to Istanbul, Salonika, as we saw in the movie last night, as well as in Italy to Ferrara, Venezia, and Ancona. In 1591 and 1593, as we mentioned, the Livornine edicts were issued. And the Jews responded immediately. The Converso Jews started coming in droves to Livorno, and the emigration for them was dangerous. Many of them lost all of their wealth. Others were able to get their wealth out and bring it to Livorno and transfer their wealth so they could continue with their international trade. Some were very fortunate, others less so. So the Jewish population then grew rapidly. The Sephardic elite was then joined by Jews from other parts of Italy. However, it's important to remember that the Medicis favored the Sephardic elite rather than what they call the Italiani, the Jews who had been in Italy already, originally in Italy. They favored them because of their wealth and their financial power. So, and it was not until, an interesting fact, it was not until 1968 that the Edict of Expulsion was formally revoked in Spain. So that's very, very late. Here we have a picture that we saw actually in the film last night. Okay, this is a famous picture called The Expulsion of Jews from Spain. It was painted in the late 19th century by an artist, Solomon Alexander Hart, who was a prominent British artist and the first Jewish member of the British Royal Academy. And on the left, we see the Portuguese philosopher with the beard on the left, the Portuguese philosopher and statesman Isaac ben Juda Abravanel, who was born into a distinguished Iberian Jewish family. In 1492, he spent his personal fortune, which was considerable, trying to, I guess you could use the word bribe, influence the monarchy, Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, to prevent the expulsion, to stop the expulsions. He was willing to give all of his wealth for this purpose. He devoted himself to this. He also was attempting to get the Edict of Expulsion revoked. So King Ferdinand was dissuaded. On the right, you see the king and queen. And in the center, as was mentioned yesterday in the film, we see Torquemada, who was the Grand Inquisitor. Apparently I did not know this until yesterday, there's rumors that he himself may have been from a Converso family. And I don't think it's been proven, but there's definitely rumors about it, which makes it even more tragic. He is clutching his crucifix in the picture, as you can see, and he is telling the monarch at the right, are you like Judas, are you going to betray your Lord for the Jewish money? And apparently, we are told that this was a decisive factor in the king and queen saying, absolutely not, we're not going to betray our Lord. And unfortunately, Abravanel, after all of that effort and really begging to prevent the expulsion, revoke the Edict of Expulsion, he got 2 days of reprieve. So there's 2 days where the Jews were 2 days later they were expelled, basically. So who were the conversos that came to Livorno? There were two types, just in a nutshell. We have the Ponentine Jews, who were the Portuguese Jews who arrived directly to Italy from Portugal, and the Levantine Jews who reached Livorno after living in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. And as we said, the Sephardic Jews were much stronger, economically more powerful than the Italiani Jews who were already there, and the Medicis deferred to them completely, even when it came to religious rights. Which we'll discuss in a minute, how that affected the religious rights. Here we have Cosimo de Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany. What was Cosimo's relationship with the Converso Jews? Very mixed. He sort of gave and then he took away. So in the 1540s, Cosimo recognized the potential of Jewish entrepreneurship. In the 1540s, he began recruiting affluent Spanish and Portuguese Jews to resettle in Florence. He began courting Jews of the Iberian Peninsula who had been dispersed by the expulsions of the 1490s. And in 1548, which is very early, he issued an invitation to foreigners, including fugitive conversos, to come to Livorno. His idea met with very little success. People paid almost no attention to it. They ignored it. He did not, and he was angry about this, supposedly, what we're told. And what did he do? He turned around and reinstated several things. So on the one hand, he's welcoming the Jews to come, the conversos to come, and on the other hand, he's saying, okay, if no one's going to pay attention to this, this is what I'm going to do. In 1567, he reimposed the yellow identification badges that for Florentines to wear, signaling that they're Jewish. In 1569, he shut down the Jewish banks. In 1570 and 71, he forced Jews to live in 2 ghettos in Florence and Siena. Here we have the Grand Duke who really accomplished making Livorno the successful economic powerhouse that it became. So we have Ferdinand I de Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was the successor to Cosimo. And what was his role in helping the Converso Jews? So Ferdinand, as we said, issued the famous Livornine edicts of 1591 and 1593. What was his goal? His goal was purely financial. It was to attract wealthy Converso Jews and their descendants to create a maritime powerhouse, and make Livorno a maritime powerhouse, taking a swamp. It was an unusual example of urban planning for the time, in fact, that they were able to sort of lay the train tracks and then have the Jews come, which is exactly what they did. It was highly unusual, very, very few examples of this. So he issued an edict to men of the East and West, Spanish and Portuguese, Italians, Hebrews, Turks, Moors, Armenians, Persians, and others. Generous privileges were granted to foreign merchants, primarily conversos, who would settle in Livorno permanently. They had to basically say that they would be there permanently. They did not want people coming and going and profiting. They wanted them to stay and establish communities there. And the Medicis succeeded in attracting some of the wealthiest Mediterranean Converso trading companies to Livorno. What was interesting as well is that not only were the Jews not in a ghetto, they were permitted to travel. So the Medicis were very smart with this. They said, okay, we want you to keep up all of your ties in North Africa, in Goa, in India, which we saw in the film last night, and you can travel freely. So this was highly unusual. And this was really, the Livornina was really an act of enlightened self-interest by Ferdinand, who foresaw this all happening. So where did the Converso Jews live? They were able to own real estate, which is very unusual, to own real estate in any part of Livorno that they chose, and to rent out real estate. They were able to open shops and businesses in all parts of the city. However, they were often forbidden to live in the same building as Christians. So there were certain restrictions. They couldn't take the same staircase. There were certain restrictions. However, they could live in any part of the city they chose. But many of the Jewish leaders decided that they did not want to live in the same neighborhood as their Christian neighbors. So the Jewish leaders had a certain section near the synagogue, which we're going to see in a minute, the original synagogue, sort of marked off for the Jews. They wanted to have their own neighborhoods, and they were even willing to pay the Christians who were living in those buildings or houses to get out, to vacate, and they compensated them, and then the neighborhoods became Jewish. Pressure on the Medicis to put the Jews back into a ghetto, like they had done in Florence and Siena. The Medicis were able to withstand all of that pressure and did never put the Jews in Livorno in a ghetto. The wealthiest Converso Jews lived in mansions outside the city, owned real estate, and had slaves. Many of them were Jewish slaves, who were employed mostly as house slaves. Those Jewish slaves, and we see in some of the Livornine documents, were able to, if they renounced their Judaism, they were able to become free. So that was something that we saw that also happened. Here's a famous quote that you see on top, which really references the prominence of the Jewish community in this early modern period. It is better to lay a hand on a Grand Duke than a Jew. And this is a popular saying And Livorno's strategic location on the Tyrrhenian Sea really made it very, very valuable for the Medicis to profit from the Jewish entrepreneurship and the Jewish maritime successes. So in 1606, the Medicis granted Livorno the status of a city, a free port, which is very, very important. Okay. And became, as Livorno eventually, after those 300 years, went into its decline, the status of being a free port city was taken away from Livorno. So we won't have time to get into that too much now, but the idea that Livorno was granted this status as a free port and people from all over the world could trade there was very significant in its success. So Livorno became a haven for Spanish Jews and descendants of conversos who had fled the Inquisition. Hope we have time to quickly look at this famous Monumento dei Quattro Muri, the monument of the four Moors. Here we see the statue. It's actually two statues that they combined. You see Ferdinand's a victorious statue of Ferdinand I of Medici, who of course invited in 1590 the Jews, the Converso Jews, to relocate to Livorno, as we said. And the statue really was commemorative of Ferdinand's victory over the Ottomans. And it is still there, you can see it today. It is Livorno's most famous monument, located in the Piazza Michele on the waterfront. And the four Moors that you see at the bottom were slaves representing the four corners of the earth, representing his, obviously, prominence. And they're depicted, if you see, it's hard to see it up close, but they're depicted in sort of contorted, agonized positions. Now here we see the Livornian Edict itself. Wait a second. There we go. There is a copy of the Livornian Edict. If you go to the Dewey Library at the University of Pennsylvania, you can see the original Livornian Edict. And one of the famous lines, there are several, the document is fascinating, but I just thought this: none shall be able to make any inquisition, inquiry, examination, or accusal against you. So the Livornine, what are some of the provisions that the Leggi Livornine provided? Well, religious tolerance, access to education were two of the very important. Jews could live once again openly as Jews, and many of the conversos chose, even though it had been generations since they had been Jewish, chose to return to Judaism. And the Jewish doctors could treat Jewish patients, Jewish families could use Christian midwives, and all of that, have Jewish housekeepers, let's say, who were Christian, nursemaids, no requirement to wear Jewish badges. That was gone. And the main thing, which you see underlined, is that it provided amnesty for the so-called transgressions that had been previously committed under the Inquisition. It wiped the slate clean. If there's anything you were accused of, once you got to Livorno, it's over. So Jews, of course, again, were no longer restricted to the rag trade. And from what I understand, there's even a provision in the Livornine, I believe it's the 1593 one, that says Jews are not allowed to engage in the rag trade. That secondhand rag trade is like, that's over. You can engage in any profession you want. So these freedoms were granted for a period of 25 years with an option to renew, basically. Let's see what happens for 25 years. Can we build up Livorno as a port? And the answer was yes, and it was an example of outstanding success. And the Medici Duke supported the Jewish nation. They called it the Jewish nation's interest. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the Jewish nation too much, except to say that the success was really unprecedented. And by the late 17th century, the Jewish population increased to 3,000. And the Jews were often, when they were converting back to Judaism, Ferdinand wanted them to do that in North Africa or wherever they were coming from before they arrived in Livorno. So by the time they arrived in Livorno, he wanted them to already be Jewish, if that's what they chose. So, okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here. The Hebrew nation, extremely important. The one thing I want you to know is that the Jews were not considered individuals. They were considered a nation. So that had positive tax benefits for them and financial benefits, negative in the sense that they could not be represented in government. They had to pay Catholics to represent their interests in government. So they weren't equal, so to speak. However, they were granted extraordinary rights. So they obviously put up with it, and they hired Christians to represent them in their interests. Okay. Unfortunately, this is the last thing I want to show you. The Jewish publishing. Here's the famous Belforte publishing house, which is still in existence today. This is a great poster from, I think, from the 1920s or before, showing the famous Belforte. It's da Belforte troverete il libro che vi interessa. From Belforte, you'll find the book that interests you. So it's and here's the original synagogue destroyed during World War II. And this is today's synagogue, the modern synagogue, which was built after the Holocaust, and as a symbol of survival. You can visit it. I highly encourage you to visit Livorno. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about all of the other wonderful things that you can see today in Livorno. And here's and then some of these are here we have some of the classic, delicious specialties. And here is a picture of the port of Livorno today. It's really quite lovely. And I highly encourage everyone to delve more into the Livorno journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.